So here's our discussion about the film Black Panther. Now, the genre of the superhero film is very big right now. It's 2022 as I'm recording this video. And it has been for several years, and the genre shows little, if any, sign of slowing down. And it's easy to dismiss the superhero film as purely escapism, with no underlying value, not addressing any particular themes, nothing to really, enlighten one or make one think. And most superhero films, like most films, and like most books, and like most poems, and like most songs in general, don't have much value. They are just for entertainment, although I think there's nothing at all wrong with something that is purely for entertainment. There are, even given that, however, quite a number of superhero films that we can dig a little deeper into. The 2000 film X-Men, for example, directed by Bryan Singer, is the film that arguably began the era of the modern, thoughtfully produced superhero film. And X-Men is chock full of stuff that we can apply to the real world. We can apply its, quote, mutant-human relationship to really any discussion of a disenfranchised, kind of marginalized minority population and the dynamics that go on between that population and the majority population. We can talk about racism, we can talk about sexism, we can talk about ethno-nationalism, there's your college word for the day, and all kinds of things. And while X-Men was probably the first superhero film to really traffic in big ideas like this, it was not the last. The 2016 film Batman vs. Superman, although that film did not do as well as the studio wanted it to at the box office, it still pulled in nearly $1 billion. And I did the math on this actually not terribly long ago. And Warner Brothers has made over $1 billion in pure profit from that film and its various iterations. Well over $1 billion at this point, actually, because I did the math a couple of years ago. So, although there was talk at the time of Batman vs. Superman having been a flop or a poor film or something like that, it was none of those things. And this isn't a video about Batman vs. Superman, although I'd like to make one of those. But that is one of those films that and this is going to be a word that sounds odd when applied to a superhero film, it very realistically depicts the fear among the American electorate in the year that it was released, 2016. A lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of uneasiness as people were looking at national and international situations that seemed out of their control and that by and large they did not understand. And generally speaking, we as humans fear that which we don't understand. And if the thing we don't understand seems particularly powerful or in a position to influence our lives, then axiomatically the greater our fear of it. Now, Black Panther does not traffic in fear. At least not that I can really think of. That's certainly not one of the things that we'll talk about in it. But the film that began the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Iron Man, in 2008, and yes, I know that X-Men is kind of sort of a Marvel film, but the rights were owned by a different studio. So it hardly counts as part of the MCU, as the Marvel Cinematic Universe is known. But Iron Man had the opportunity to really delve into all kinds of important issues. The political and personal toxic nature of the American military-industrial complex, the way that American foreign policy is perceived in other parts of the world, and so on and so forth. But by and large, it didn't do that. It sort of gestured at those things and then moved on to stuff that was just more purely fun. And most of the movies in the Marvel Cinematic Universe since then have been pretty content to do that, to only wave, if even do that, at deeper themes and more thoughtful ideas. But Black Panther is very much an exception. It's probably not a coincidence that so far As far as I know, as of 2022, Black Panther is the only Marvel Cinematic Universe film to receive an Academy Award nomination for Best Picture. It didn't win, but we could argue that it was as deserving of winning as whatever did win that year. Your study guide lists a bunch of topics that we're going to address in Black Panther, and we're not going to address these in any particular order, other than just the order they're listed on the study guide, and even then we might do some jumping around. And we certainly won't touch on every scene and every line in the film that is relevant to these topics, but we'll try to hit the highlights. The first thing that is listed on your study guide is the fact that human life began in Africa. Anthropologically, historically, we know this to be a fact, and that is a thing that the film touches on in multiple ways, but the biggest one is probably when Killmonger, that's the villain, right, is talking with T'Challa, King of Wakanda. This is, probably about 2/3 of the way through the film. And Killmonger essentially says, why don't you use Wakandan technology to bring justice and right the wrongs that have been done to black people and other oppressed peoples across the entire world? Because you could do that. And T'Challa says something like, I am not the king of every other country. I am the king of Wakanda. And Killmonger responds, well, human life began in Africa, so doesn't that kind of make you king of everyone? That's an interesting line, and certainly, strictly speaking, no, that doesn't make one king of everyone. But the point that Killmonger is making, which is one of ethics, which is why do you, T'Challa, who has the ability to right these wrongs across the world, why do you let them continue? When you have the ability to right them, and one could argue the obligation to right them. And that's kind of a difficult point to argue against. And when T'Challa goes to the plane of the ancestors, this is after he has been defeated, in ritual combat with Killmonger, and his mother and his sister and his girlfriend and Agent Ross, the American CIA guy, find him up at in the care of the guerrilla tribe, and they feed him the elixir made from the purple herb or the purple flower. I don't recall exactly what it's called. And he goes to the ancestral plane, and he sees his father and all the previous monarchs of Wakanda. And this is an area that we'll get into in more detail in just a little bit. And they essentially say, well, it's time for you to come join us. It's not our way to interfere in the doings of other nations. And T'Challa says, you were wrong, all of you, in letting all this suffering go on that you could have helped. So, and we're getting into another topic here. This isn't exactly about human life beginning in Africa. But you'll find as we go through the study guide that lots of these topics, most of them, in fact, relate to several others. And so it may seem like we're doing a lot of jumping around. But as I say, it's all of a piece. And in art, it very often is difficult to separate out individual strands of discussion or meaning or achievement from the whole tapestry, as it were. Because a well-done piece of art, although art is, the nature of art is subjective, and what is well done is often very subjective. But by and large, you will find that really well done storytelling, whether it's plays or novels or short stories or film, well done storytelling is pretty tightly interwoven. The scenes and the characters and so forth all really seem to kind of belong together. There's not much that's just sort of out of left field, unlike in life, right? There is an old adage, and I don't recall the origin of this saying, but it's essentially that fiction has to make sense. Life doesn't. And I don't know who came up with that idea, first of all, but truer words could not have been spoken, because frequently life does not make any sense, now does it? Things can happen that no one saw coming, and no one could have predicted coming, and that seem to make absolutely no damn sense at all. If that happened in a piece of fiction, we would say, oh, that's not realistic. That's not how it works. Well, that is how it works a lot of the time. But by and large, fiction avoids crazy out of the blue developments, and things generally are, as I say, woven together, interlaced pretty well. And a fiction that does have out of the blue crazy coincidences generally is criticized. We say, oh, there is a deus ex machina, or even if we don't say that specifically, that's what we mean when we criticize some weird thing that seems out of place in a piece of fiction. So anyway, back to Black Panther. One of the elements of reality that the film deals with, or at least refers to many times, is black poverty and oppression. We see the situation of the young Killmonger, well, quite some time before he's known as Killmonger, growing up in, I think it's Oakland, California is the name of the community that we are given. And he's growing up in poverty. And throughout the film, Killmonger's sort of motivation is to take the throne of Wakanda so that he can use the power of Wakanda to right the social wrongs and other wrongs that are being done to black people and oppressed groups around the world. And as I said earlier, it's kind of hard to argue with that goal because that would seem to be an ethical, noble thing to do. Now, whether or not Killmonger is going about it in an ethical way is a whole other question. But the goal itself, which is to help people who are oppressed no longer be oppressed, honestly, I don't see how one can think that that's a bad idea. One of the most heartbreaking scenes in the film comes when Killmonger drinks the purple herb or the purple flower or whatever it is, when he's being given the powers of the Black Panther. And his version of the ancestral plane is not this verdant field, beautiful on the African plains with wildlife in the background and so forth, like T'Challa's version of the plane of the ancestors is. Killmonger's plane of the ancestors is the crummy little apartment where he lived when he was very small. And he's there in the ancestral plane version of this, and he meets his father there, and at one point his father says, "No tears for me." And the child version of Killmonger says, "It's just life around here." I think that's a really tough scene. And the idea that there are children who understand that people being killed unjustly right in front of you and so forth, that's just how life goes. And they can accept that without the blink of an eye. And there are millions upon millions upon millions upon millions upon millions of such children in such situations around the globe. That reality seems pretty terrible. To me, that seems pretty terrible. As I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, maybe not even that long, as when you're recording a thing like this, you do a lot of pausing and restarting, and so exactly when you said something tends to get a little fuzzy. But anyway, we could argue that Killmonger's goal is admirable, but the ways that he chooses to go about it are not necessarily so. He says to T'Challa at one point, "I'm going to use the oppressors' methods against them." And T'Challa says, "You have become them," meaning you have learned the brutality, you have learned the ruthlessness and so forth of the oppressors to such an extent that there will be no difference between you and them, except you will be oppressing from a different side. That's yeah, it's kind of hard to argue with that too. Human trafficking. This is a thing that the film doesn't do very much with, but there's a pretty pointed scene very early in the film. It's when we first meet T'Challa and his girlfriend, Nkoye, I think it's Nkoye, she's out in the world sort of undercover, and she has infiltrated a human trafficking ring. And especially they're trafficking specifically in women. This is a thing that goes on. This is a thing that goes on a lot. Human trafficking in women and children around the world. And as I say, the film doesn't do very much with this, but the fact that it crops up at all is good, because any chance, right, to call attention to something so horrific is probably a good chance. We get a little bit of this attention paid to human trafficking in another MCU film, Black Widow, in which the title sequence sort of plays out against the backdrop of trafficking in women and children. And this is not a video about X-Men or about Iron Man, it's not a video about Black Widow either. But it's, I drop in these references to make the point that important things in superhero films might be rare, but they do exist. The difference between appearance and reality is something that crops up pretty regularly in fiction. There's that passage in the novel Jurassic Park in which John Hammond is talking with Henry Wu, when Henry Wu says, who's the head scientist, says, well, I think that we should breed the dinosaurs differently. I should alter their DNA to make them slower, a little more domesticated. And John Hammond says, Henry, people want real dinosaurs. And Wu says, no, they don't want reality. They want their expectation of reality, which is a very different thing. And that's just an example of appearance versus reality, and the difference between the two in this type of fiction. In Black Panther, two of the ways that appearance versus reality occurs, well, one of them is in the fact that, okay, we'll just talk about one actually. Wakanda, to all appearances, is this pastoral place. It's a third world nation, shepherds, farming, poverty, and all that kind of thing. But the reality is that while shepherds and farming, might be a part of Wakanda, and indeed they would have to be, any self-sustaining, I almost said ecosystem. Any self-sustaining nation has to have those things. But the reality is that Wakanda is incredibly technologically advanced, astoundingly powerful, perhaps more so than any other nation on the planet in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And this is a reality that is known only to a few. Claw, the bad guy, played by Andy Serkis, he knows it, and he is trying to convince CIA agent Everett Ross of this in the interrogation scene that takes place there in South Korea. And, then a little bit later, of course, Agent Ross finds out that, yes, this is true. Wakanda is this amazing place, and he had no idea. And at the end of the film, when T'Challa is giving a speech at the United Nations, apparently, and this is the note, right, that the film ends on. And one of the delegates says, well, with all respect, Your Highness, what can a nation of farmers and shepherds possibly offer to the rest of the world? And there's just this shot of this interesting, subtle little expression on T'Challa's face. And then that's the end of the film. And it will be interesting in films beyond this one to see how the Marvel Cinematic Universe deals with this. What will Wakanda provide to the rest of the world? We shall see. Another area, I guess, that we'll get into that relates kind of to the notion of appearance versus reality is the area of mysticism. Because we see, and we've mentioned this already in the discussion, that T'Challa twice goes to the ancestral plane where he converses with his father and other previous monarchs of Wakanda. And Killmonger goes to the ancestral plane, which is very different than the one T'Challa went to. And the question is, are they really going to an ancestral plane? Or is this merely a psychological thing, some kind of, effect brought about by the, hallucinogenic qualities that perhaps the initial administration of the purple herb brings about? Don't know. the film does not really give us an answer to that. And ultimately, it probably doesn't matter which of those it's supposed to be. Is the reality that they go to an ancestral plane, or is that just the appearance that the person who has taken the herb, perceives? Don't know. And what the reality is, as I say, is open to question. Cultural appropriation. Now, this ties right in with the idea of national identity. And by appropriation, cultural appropriation, what we mean is the taking of elements from some other culture and then claiming them as, belonging to one's own culture. And we get a pretty pointed exchange in the British Museum between Killmonger and the curator there, when he says to her, "Well, don't worry, I'll take this artifact off your hands." And she says, "Well, this isn't for sale, sir." And Killmonger says something like, "Well, how do you think your ancestors got this? They didn't pay a fair price for it. They simply took it. And that's what I'm going to do." And in reality, the historical methods of the British Museum and the ethics of its continuing to keep possession of the thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of artifacts that it has, artifacts that arguably were blatantly stolen from their countries of origin, that's kind of a hullabaloo, and that is a problem that the British Museum is wrestling with even today. Cultural appropriation can take other forms. It can take the form of sort of cultural invasion, actually, when an outside culture injects itself, usually in a way that is perhaps initially desired, but whose extent is not fully recognized by the culture into which the insertion is taking place. American culture in the real world has inserted itself in, I almost said nearly everywhere, but I guess I don't know. But certainly American culture has inserted itself into lots and lots and lots of places around the globe, including places where it is not wanted. And there are complaints in the real world that these places where American culture has taken root are losing their own cultures. And we get a bit of that idea in the film Black Panther as well. Not necessarily with American culture, but with the idea that, if the Wakandans do not stay true to their own traditions, the way they have always done things, and so forth, then they will begin to lose their national identity. And we see this especially we've seen it in one scene we've talked about already, when Killmonger is talking with T'Challa, and T'Challa says, "Well, I'm not the king of other countries, I'm the king of Wakanda." And then Killmonger says, "Well, human life began in Africa, so aren't you kind of the king of everywhere else as well?" But T'Challa is saying, "No, I'm not going to reach out and impose Wakandan values and Wakandan whatever upon other nations." And this dedication to tradition, to cultural, sort of maintaining the cultural status quo, is one that we see multiple other times in the film. Near the beginning of the film, when T'Challa is, he's the powers of the Black Panther have been stripped away from him. He's going to be crowned king, but there's the ritual combat section during which anyone who wants to challenge can challenge. And M'Baku, who is the leader of the guerrilla tribe, says that he will challenge for the throne of Wakanda. And the biggest reason that he gives is because he doesn't feel that the Wakandans are respecting tradition. And he is especially disparaging of Shuri, T'Challa's younger sister, whom he says scoffs at tradition. "We will not have it," he says. And so then the combat goes on, and you see how it goes. Later in the film, in South Korea, after Killmonger has been captured and then escaped, and the American CIA agent Everett Ross is wounded fatally, unless they can get him to Wakanda. T'Challa says that's what he's going to do. We're going to take him to Wakanda where he can be fixed, where he can be healed. And General Okoye says that is not our way. And T'Challa essentially says that's what we're going to do regardless. And so that is what they do. T'Challa is at this moment where he has to decide what is more important. Maintaining, tradition, maintaining the way things always have been done, or saving a life. And he determines that saving a life, in this case, is the right thing to do. And he never regrets that in the course of the film. And then when T'Challa goes to the ancestral plane the second time, and he says to his father, "Why did you not bring the boy home?" Meaning, the young Killmonger who was left behind in America after his father was killed by T'Challa's father. And T'Chaka's ghost, or whoever, says, "Well, the boy was the shame that we had to keep hidden, and we could not bring him home for the sake of Wakanda." Because they could not bring a parent. And that's a little unclear to me how bringing the child back to Wakanda would somehow be against Wakandan tradition or something, but that's how T'Chaka saw it. And T'Challa says, "You were wrong. All of you were wrong in ignoring the rest of the world." So by the end of the film then, T'Challa is choosing to move opposite tradition, opposite the way that things have always been. And Wakanda is not seeking to appropriate other cultures, nor does it seem to be seeking to impose itself on other cultures. But under T'Challa, Wakanda is going to share, to some extent, with the world good things that it can share. So, and I guess it will be up then to individual nations throughout the rest of the world to decide the extent to which they want to share in that. And of course, this whole question of Wakanda keeping itself apart from the rest of the world, for the good of Wakanda and for the sake of tradition and so forth, is related to this idea of national identity and the extent to which isolation serves the purpose of national identity. There are those folks in the real world who would assert that in order to maintain a national identity, one's nation should just not interfere in the affairs of other nations, even if asked, even if the interference is for humanitarian reasons, demonstrable humanitarian reasons, or something like that. Such a perspective, and regardless of your socio-political affiliations or preferences, such a perspective tends to ignore the degree to which the world has become interconnected, economically, politically, economically, politically, militarily, and so forth. And T'Challa, in seeking or in deciding to reach out and to offer Wakandan knowledge and so forth, to whatever extent to the rest of the world, is electing to some extent, de-isolate Wakanda for the good of the rest of the world. And there's that wonderful speech at the end where T'Challa, speaking to, we assume, the United Nations, says, "In times of crisis, the wise build bridges, while the foolish build walls." That's a pretty good line to remember. In times of crisis, people help each other, rather than shutting each other out. And this is also part of the speech, I can't remember the whole thing from memory. T'Challa says essentially, in this time of global crisis, we need to recognize that far more unites us than divides us. So that is what is said in the film. So T'Challa is seeking to reach out, to have Wakanda no longer isolated, for the good of the rest of the world, perhaps for the good of Wakanda. I suppose that remains to be seen in the MCU. We've mentioned tradition multiple times in the discussion so far, and certainly tradition, as it is portrayed in the film, is a pretty powerful influence. The tradition of Wakanda minding its own affairs is very important. We see that voiced by multiple characters throughout the film. And we see, this is one of the reasons that the film was lauded, meaning praised, so widely. Wakanda obviously is not an actual place. Okay, it's not an actual culture. But the Wakandan culture, as we see it in the film, is, as I understand it, I am not a scholar in African culture, but as I understand it, the Wakandan culture, as it is presented, does a pretty good job of providing an authentic African cultural vibe. That's a technical term, vibe. The dances, the dress, the language that the Wakandans speak most of the time in the film is based on an actual language, but I can't remember specifically which one. Chadwick Boseman, the actor who plays T'Challa, in fact, after he got that role, traveled to Africa, to, I don't recall what region of Africa, specifically so he could develop his ear for the dialects in that region, so that he could speak the invented Wakandan language more convincingly. On your study guide, there are several bullet points under the title Role of Tradition. And we've spoken about some of these things, the idea of mysticism in culture. Some other things we haven't touched on quite so much. The ritual combat, for example, that T'Challa engages in at the beginning of the film and then later in the film when Killmonger shows up and says, I am of royal blood too. So, I challenge you to combat for the right to the throne. Well, obviously, this is stupid. Ritual combat is, to see the winner has the right to, whatever political station or whatever. That's just stupid. And yet, I say that, and yet tradition, an often really stupid tradition, has a role in the politics and the societies, the cultures of nations around the world, including the United States. So, we can look at, ritual combat in the movie and go, that's just dumb. But, is it really any dumber than some things that happen in the United States that we cling to largely because we've always done it that way? Not to single anything out, but probably not. We could probably find things that to an outsider would seem just as foolish in American culture as the ritual combat does in the movie. Now, also in the film, it's clear that no one actually expects anybody to take up the challenge. When M'Baku and the guerrilla tribe, accept, the invitation to do ritual combat before T'Challa's coronation near the beginning of the film, it's clear that no one expected this to happen. And then when Killmonger shows up, more than halfway through the film, and says that he is going to challenge T'Challa to ritual combat, clearly nobody expected that to happen. And in fact, the advisors in T'Challa's court say, do not do it. But T'Challa, observing tradition, says, okay, I will. He is seeking to preserve tradition to the extent that he can. And this arguably turns out to be a mistake, at least in the short term. And notice how Killmonger manipulates tradition. He uses tradition to get himself into Wakanda, he uses it to get to Wakandan throne, but then he discards it when it no longer serves his interest. When T'Challa shows up a bit later in the film, close to the end, and says, I am not dead, as you can see, and I did not yield, so the combat is not finished, Killmonger says, nah, that trial by combat shit is done. And that's a direct quote. And at least I think it's that insert down shit is done, whatever he says. But he's discarding tradition because it no longer serves his interests. And even T'Challa's friend, the fellow who trains the battle rhino, I want a battle rhino. Is that so much to ask for? I really want one. Is big on tradition throughout much of the film. But then, when T'Challa does not bring Ulysses Claw, played by Andy Serkis, back after he's gone out after him. T'Challa's friend is disappointed and ultimately sides with Killmonger in deciding to reject tradition and go out into the world and wage war against the oppressors and so forth. And even when T'Challa shows back up, his friend still sides with Killmonger and goes off to kill T'Challa, despite what tradition says. So tradition is strong in the film. It's shown as having a very strong role in Wakandan culture and so forth. But it does not have an iron grip on everything. And something that I think is particularly cool is the way that tradition and technology are fused in the film. The shields that the Wakandan troops use, they look like just traditional big old African type shields, but they're not. They have, these sort of force field powers and that kind of thing. The spears are basically big laser type guns and all that kind of thing. And, even the very futuristic, Wakandan capital city is just full of things that look very, very traditional and very, very real, all the way through, quite alongside, the powered structures and so forth. It occurs to me I should say something about political wisdom in here. And we've already said something about it when T'Challa is speaking with the United Nations and says, in this time of crisis, we need more than ever to recognize that more unites us than divides us. And he makes that line about, in times of crisis, the wise build bridges while the foolish build barriers or build walls, however he phrases it. Okay, guys, twice now I have failed to hit the record button, and so I have talked for anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes. And then looked down and went, oh, hey, turns out I'm not recording. This most recent time, I just looked down and went, oh, I'm not recording, meaning I'm not recording again the stuff I failed to record the first time. The first time, I looked down and noticed I wasn't recording, and then my granddaughter showed up at my house, and my son, who's 30, I'm older, maybe I'm older than I look, I don't know. And we went outside, and it's hot as hell here, and so I'm sweaty, and my shirt got disgusting and so forth. But I went, no, I'm going to finish this video. So I took off my sweaty shirt, and I put on this really informal thing. Pardon me, pardon the informality of the situation. This is going to be the Cliff's Notes version of all the stuff that I have now talked about twice, but haven't managed to record. But on your study guide, we're down to the ambiguity of good and bad. Altruism. Altruism is doing good for someone because it is doing good for them. No other reason. And altruism is clearly related to idealism, right? The notion that the right thing is the right thing and we should do the right thing no matter what. Why? Because it's the right thing. And that is different than pragmatism. Pragmatism is doing the practical thing. Now, there is a line that, and I may have already covered this, that T'Challa's father, the first time T'Challa visits the ancestral plane, his father, T'Chaka, says, "You are a good man, and it is hard for a good man to be king." This is a bit of political wisdom that has been known for many centuries. The medieval Italian writer Niccolò Machiavelli wrote a book called The Prince, in which Machiavelli wrote that sometimes a ruler will have to do things that may even seem bad in the short term to bring about a much greater good, especially in the long term. Unfortunately, that political reality and what Machiavelli writes has become simplified in the popular imagination into the idea that the end justifies the means, meaning do whatever you have to do, regardless of what it is. As long as you get what you want, everything's fine. No. That is not what Machiavelli meant at all. He meant something much closer to what T'Chaka tells T'Challa. That, a good person may have to do things that don't necessarily seem good in order to bring about a greater good or a good in the long term. Now, in South Korea, in the film, after Claw has been captured and then escaped, and Agent Ross has been mortally wounded, saving Shuri, no, not Shuri, sorry, Nicoya. I need to brush up on my pronunciations, clearly. Saving T'Challa's girlfriend, Nakoya, and Okoye and T'Challa. And T'Challa decides that the right thing to do is to take Agent Ross back to Wakanda where he can be healed. And General Okoye chooses the pragmatic position, which is the position of sort of national self-preservation. And she says, if we do that, this man is bound to then go back and tell his government what he has seen, and that will reveal the Wakandans. And T'Challa responds, this man will die for trying to save us. And General Okoye responds, that was his choice. And T'Challa says, no, the right thing to do is to take him to Wakanda, so that's what we're going to do. Both of them are correct. Both Okoye and T'Challa are correct in what they are saying. Now, you or I may prefer one decision or one course of action over the other, but both of them have very solid points on their sides. We also see this in the civil war that occurs in Wakanda later on in the film when Killmonger is on the throne. But we'll get to that here in just a minute. Vengeance versus mercy. This is also a thing that we see multiple times in the film. And in particular, we see this when T'Challa is in ritual combat. The first time against M'Baku near the beginning of the film. And then again when T'Challa is fighting Killmonger in ritual combat. In both those combats, if you rewatch those scenes, you'll see T'Challa has multiple opportunities to kill his opponents, but he does not take them. In fact, before the second fight with Killmonger, he says to Killmonger, it is not too late to stop this and settle things another way. But Killmonger will not have anything to do with that. And T'Challa chooses multiple times not to kill Killmonger during that battle. And that is to T'Challa's detriment, because Killmonger very nearly kills him, as we see. And in the first battle, and the rules of the ritual combat are made very clear at the outset, which is it continues until one combatant dies or yields. And in the first combat, T'Challa could kill M'Baku multiple times, but doesn't. And at the end of the fight, has M'Baku in the leg hold or something. I don't recall the exact hold that he has him in. And he says, yield, man. And M'Baku won't do it. And T'Challa emphasizes, he says, you have fought with honor. Now yield, your people need you. T'Challa really wants to show mercy here. And wisely, M'Baku yields. And this comes back, this act of mercy comes back to help T'Challa later in the film, both when M'Baku and the guerrilla tribe save his life, and then when M'Baku and his warriors show up to help in the final battle against Killmonger. Okay, so vengeance is a cultural thing for us. We like vengeance, even though in a Judeo-Christian culture we're not supposed to. What's that passage? Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. This is not me pushing a particular religious perspective on you. Just saying that in a Judeo-Christian culture we're not supposed to like vengeance, but we do. It's maybe we're hardwired as humans to like vengeance. I don't know. But let's now jump to the Civil War near the end of the film. This is a clash of perspectives. T'Challa's perspective is that, yes, maybe the oppressed people across the world need to be freed. Maybe Wakanda should have something to do with this. But simply exporting weapons and violence across the globe is bad. That's not what we're going to do. Killmonger has a different perspective, to put it mildly. It is hard, I think, it would be difficult from an objective point of view to say that Killmonger's perspective that the oppressors do not, his perspective that the oppressors kind of deserve what they get. It's difficult to argue that that's completely inaccurate. It's also difficult to argue that it's completely accurate. And let's think about some other things there, too. T'Challa's friend, the guy who trains the battle rhino, once Killmonger is king, and Killmonger is, in the royal audience chamber there, and he says what his plan is, what they're going to do, everybody in the room says, no, that's not our way, that we can't do that. T'Challa's friend says that in the very near future, the world will be divided into the conquerors and the conquered. I would much rather be among the former. That's a pragmatic position. And again, it's hard to argue with that position. And anyway, it doesn't matter because Killmonger's the king and he says this is what we're going to do. So that's what they do. Now, also clash of perspectives on a slightly smaller scale. When T'Challa shows back up alive, when T'Challa apparently has been killed, when Killmonger, throws him off the edge of the waterfall at the end of the second ritual combat, T'Challa's girlfriend, Nakoya, and T'Challa's sister, Shuri, and T'Challa's mother, the Queen Mother, all, are going to flee because they know correctly that Killmonger will have them murdered. Okoye says to General Okoye, come with us. General Okoye won't do it. She says, no, my loyalty is to the throne, and it is to Wakanda. And that's how she sees her position. She needs to be loyal to the throne, regardless of who is on it. And, T'Challa's girlfriend sees it differently because she thinks Killmonger is not worthy of the throne, so she's going to be loyal to T'Challa. This whole civil war that then, breaks out when T'Challa shows up alive is over that clash of perspectives, T'Challa's buddy, the rhino training guy, and Killmonger and others think that, spreading the weapons across the globe and so forth is a correct thing to do. T'Challa thinks it's not. And General Okoye, you'll notice, is loyal to Killmonger because she's loyal to the throne and whoever the monarch is, until Killmonger refuses to continue the ritual combat. T'Challa says, I did not yield, and as you can see, I am alive, so the combat continues. And Killmonger says, no, that challenge shit is over. And then he directs the troops to go kill T'Challa. And that's the point at which Okoye says, you are not fit to be king. And she and the rest of the Dora Milaje, that's the name of the bodyguards of the king, the Dora Milaje. There's your geek trivia for the day, and I self-identify as a geek, so I don't mean that in a pejorative fashion. The Dora Milaje then finally turn against Killmonger. And then of course at the end of the film, T'Challa determines that Wakanda will break from its long, standing ways and establish Wakandan outreach centers and so forth, and everything's great. Okay, now there's a list of quotations at the bottom of your study guide. The sun will never set on the Wakandan Empire. These are just quotations that struck me as notable in the film. The sun will never set on the Wakandan Empire. That is something that Killmonger says during that royal audience when he is king and he's determining that Wakanda is going to export weapons and so forth around the globe. This character is not the first individual in literature or in life to say something very similar to this. Various Nazis said this of the Third Reich. Various Roman emperors said this of the Roman Empire. I want to say that Vladimir Putin has said something like this in the relatively near past. And the sun has not set yet on Vladimir Putin's Russian Empire, but things aren't looking that good. It's almost a given when someone says the sun will never set on whatever it is, that the sun's absolutely going to set on whatever it is. It's hard for a good man to be king. We've already talked about that line. That is when T'Chaka, says that to T'Challa. And this is my granddaughter that you see here. This is Lucy. Lucy is she's a geek and a superhero in training, along with me. So proud of her. You have fought with honor. Now yield. Your people need you. Right. That is what T'Challa says to M'Baku during that final battle, and M'Baku wisely chooses to yield and do what is right for his people. Even though M'Baku himself, it's clear, would rather keep fighting to the death, but he chooses what is best for his people. He chooses the greater good. And then this last bit, this is the exchange between Okoye and Nakoya, when Nakoya wants General Okoye to come with her, after they think T'Challa's dead. And Okoye says, I too love my country. And Okoye says, then serve your country. Meaning, do your duty, be loyal to whoever is on the throne, even if you don't like it. And Okoye says, no, I will save my country. She is choosing to put what she sees as the greater good above tradition. So there you are. All right, y'all. I think I managed to remember to hit the record button this time. And that is our discussion of Black Panther. I hope you liked this movie, and yeah, I hope you liked this movie. So, you know, you don't have to rewatch the whole movie, but if you want to, feel free. There's certainly worse ways to spend, 110 minutes. And I hope you took notes and try to correlate what you saw in the movie with what we've talked about here and what's on your study guide. And that's what we've got. You want to say thanks? No, she doesn't want to say thanks. So I'll say it. Thanks.